Right on the button, 12:45. Everybody ready? Not quite. There's always one person that is not quite.
Not quite.
We're ready, folks. Okay, I have to open my cookie from lunch, though,
Yeah.
so I can nibble on it. This is an almond joy. You want to get up and go get one? Okay. All right, this is the May 20th, 2020 meeting of the Special Joint City Council and Redevelopment Agency budget is called to order. This meeting has been properly noticed and posted in compliance with the open meeting law. These proceedings are being video recorded as well as presented live on KCLV Cable Channel 2, or closed caption for hearing impaired viewers. Please note, customers of CenturyLink and Cox Communication may view this program in high definition on Channel 1002 and in standard definition on Channel 2. You may also watch this meeting live on Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire TV, or on the Go Vegas app. I guess that Amazon Fire TV might be on that. The council meeting, as well as all other KCLV programming, may be viewed on the internet at www.kclv.tv/live. The proceedings will be rebroadcast KCLV Channel 2 on the web Wednesday of the meeting, 8 p.m., Friday, 4 a.m., Saturday, 7 p.m., Sunday, 7 a.m., following Monday at 5 p.m. For public comment related items on the agenda, citizen participation, public hearing items, we have available speaker card which you may complete and submit to our city clerk. Cards are available in the clerk's office or at the rear of these chambers. If you do not submit a card, doesn't prevent you from speaking under citizen participation or specified public hearing items. If anyone's present today who has need for hearing impaired equipment, please see our city clerk's staff. And note, if you parked in the parking garage across the street, a self-validation machines located in the foyer between council chambers and the security desk you walk through to enter these chambers. You must have your ticket with you to use the machine, but if you don't have your ticket, see security personnel when exiting. And so we are on to, okay. Agenda item 3, public comment during this portion of the agenda must be limited to matters on the agenda for action. The amount of time any single speakers allowed may be limited. All comments made must be cross-referenced to those specific items. If anyone submitted a speaker card or wishes to speak under this portion of the agenda, please come to the podium, state your name for the record. This is your opportunity to address the Council and Redevelopment Agency. But the Council and Redevelopment Agency are not able to respond or engage in dialogue. We'll set the time at 1 minute. Come rushing to the microphones, please. Faster, faster. We will move on. We will go to agenda 4. Item number 4, discussion for possible action regarding fiscal year 2021 City of Las Vegas tentative budget and fiscal year 2021 City of Las Vegas final budget, including the 5-year capital improvement plan referenced to all awards. Item number 5 is discussion for possible action regarding fiscal year 2021 City of Las Vegas redevelopment agency tentative budget and fiscal year 2021 City of Las Vegas redevelopment agency final budget. Redevelopment areas include wards as 1, 3, and 5 with Councilman Knutson and Creer and Councilwoman Diaz. Here we go. These are public hearings which I declare open.
Madam Mayor, members of the City Council, good afternoon. Scott Adams, City Manager. I'm going to just make a few prefatory comments and then turn it over to Gary Ameling, our Chief Financial Officer, to make our formal budget presentation. I just wanted to make a few comments and really offer a number of thanks to everybody involved in developing this budget. I think we've told you each week over the last 8 weeks, as we've briefed you throughout this budget process, that this has been unprecedented in terms of a budget process for the City of Las Vegas. Even the Great Recession budget cuts that we experienced paled in comparison to what we've had to accomplish for the budget we're presenting to you today. We actually had a couple of years to make $100 million in cuts over that time period, compared to $150 million that straddled 2 fiscal years that we had to accomplish literally over the last 8 weeks. You know, and I'm not making a joke out of this, but you know, nobody got a chance to have a haircut over the last 2 weeks, but I will guarantee you our departments all took a haircut. This was very serious business, and for that reason, I really want to thank all of our directors and of all of our departments for the hard work that they put into to identify cuts quickly and responsibly to get to the point where we're at today. I also want to thank Gary Aimling, Vanetta Appleyard, and the entire finance team, because we, and in addition, my city manager team, we were meeting on this all day long for days to deliberate over where to cut, how to cut, to get us in and under a budget that we could present to you that balanced and solved our financial crisis. We got lucky in the middle of it. When the CARES Act was passed and we were able to figure out how to use federal funds, but that still doesn't get the whole job done. And as Gary will show you, that we still have challenges going forward, but certainly there's light at the end of the tunnel, and it is certainly a good light as compared to what it could have been when we started the process. So with that, I just wanted to thank everybody involved. I want to thank the council for your patience and understanding in this process, because this wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for anybody. And as you see, it was profound. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Gary, and he'll make the formal budget presentation with his team.
And before he does that, as mayor of the city of Las Vegas and for our council, I want to absolutely commend you and your entire staff for the relentless pursuit of bringing this to us. We know the hours you spent and then some beyond that, but how difficult a time it was. Nobody ever dreamt of anything like this, but just to know that your ingenuity, your efforts, your basic common sense, as well as your experience, education, and everything you've brought to the table is so appreciated by each of us in all of the wards and comprehensively in the city. So I just want to commend you all, your chiefs, your directors, and everybody that participated, including the council, in giving input and but standing with you in this emergency, in this very, very challenging undertaking. So thank you and congratulations, and may we get relief and continued relief going forward and get back to the old normal rather than a new normal. So thank you, Scott, and please, Mr. Aimling.
Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon, Mayor and City Council members and members of the public that are here today. I echo Scott's thoughts about thanking the departments and the Finance Department staff, as well as yourselves, for your patience and cooperation during this process. I've been doing municipal government budgets now for 31 years, and this year's budget was not like any of the others that I've done. I've been through the dot-com bust, the 9/11 budget, I've been through the Great Recession budgets. This one was just more. Effectively, it was kind of like 3 budgets. We put together a budget, we threw it away, started again. We put together another budget, revenues dropped even more, he threw it away, started again. So I kind of count this one as my 35th or 34th year of doing budgets, because it was really like 3 or 4 years worth of budgets. There's one other group that I'd like to thank as well. Our collective bargaining groups, we've been working in partnership with them over the course of the last couple of months. We've had several meetings, and we're, I think, getting close to some agreements with the bargaining groups moving forward that's going to really help us in terms of balancing our budgets. So I thank them as well for their
Mr. Aimling,
cooperation
I would like
and
to
understanding.
mention in reference to that, I really know, I don't even question it, I know and I believe the bargaining units are part of our bigger family.
They are.
And we all have to get there together. This is not even a question. And I know for all of us as one big family here in Las Vegas, we only encourage all of us being together and helping. So thank you.
So moving on to the slides, please feel free to stop at any time and ask questions as I go through these slides. First up, just looking at a summary of the budget for fiscal year 21. We're going to be focusing today on the general fund portion of the overall city budget. This is the fund that provides the majority of the day-to-day services for the city. This final budget that we're going to present to you today, as Scott mentioned, is a balanced budget. It responds to council's priorities and our citizen survey. Believe it or not, it's been less than 3 months since we had your strategic directions workshop at the Water District on February 26th. At that workshop, you went through the results of the citizen survey, and you gave us direction in a set of newly revised policies and priorities. And we had hoped to be able to, this year, at that time at least, be able to enhance budgets in those priority areas. Unfortunately, what we've ended up having to do instead is kind of cut services less in those priority service areas than we were able to have to cut in some of the other areas. So it's been a rather unique year in terms of how we respond to your council priorities and the result of the citizen survey. The budget obviously has been impacted by COVID-19. We'll talk quite a bit about that during the course of the slideshow. There not only is impacts on this current fiscal year as we finished out the last 4 months since the pandemic really started in March of this fiscal year 20, and moving on into fiscal year 21. However, we do see that the economic impacts are going to continue on at least through fiscal year 22. Hopefully we'll get back to kind of a new normal during that year, but we still have some problems down the road, and we'll highlight some of that as well. As City Manager mentioned, the use of the Federal CARES Act funding, I'll talk about that. This really has been worse than what I would call the impacts of the Great Recession. Without the swift actions that we've taken, without the help of the federal government, and without the cooperation of our labor groups, we would have actually run out of the city's reserves during fiscal year 21. We would have effectively been insolvent. So we had to act fast, and the actions that we've taken, I think, have really put us on a good track, and hopefully will keep us there moving forward. The ongoing structural budget deficit, we talked a lot about that over the course of the last few years. Even before this event and even before an economic slowdown actually started, we already were looking forward, and we already had taken some actions to try to mitigate what we saw coming down the road as being an imbalance between the growth rates of our expenditures growing faster than the growth rates of our revenues. And so we already had taken some actions, and those actions have actually proven to be very wise because they've helped us, at least for the first year, get through this current fiscal year. I mentioned collective bargaining earlier. We're currently in collective bargaining with our bargaining units. We really need to find a way to try to reduce some of that ongoing cost increase. And so, again, we're thankful that the bargaining units have come to the table and have had discussions with us and tried to understand what our fiscal situation is. As part of our thematic goals, one of the thematic goals, I believe it was last year, was to look at innovative ways that we can restructure our services and the way we go about doing business. And we're happy to say that we're continuing on with those efforts, and they are starting to pay off for us. For example, the video inspection program that we rolled out during the course of this pandemic has been really a new way of doing things, where our inspectors can go now and have the developer videotape and show the inspector what's going on the project, and we don't have to actually go out to all the projects. So those kinds of innovations can really help us in terms of figuring out ways to operate more smartly as well as to save costs. And then we've been working on revenue enhancements. This past year you passed the environmental surcharge, and we're looking at other ways that we can help bring in more revenue to the city to help us, again, mitigate that long-term structural budget deficit. Some of the major priorities the city manager has mentioned that we are really all about the health and safety of the city's employees, the health and safety of the city's residents, businesses, and other stakeholders, and as well as maintaining our essential operations and services. Some of the major actions that we've taken in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, right away we formed an internal COVID-19 response team made up primarily of the city manager's office staff. We opened the EOC right away for logistical support. We went through the process of identifying each of our department's essential and non-essential services and therefore the employees that provided those services. We had to, because of our fiscal situation, we had to furlough those non-essential employees. Some of those were reassigned to assist in some of the essential areas, and thanks so much for those employees who were reassigned for the work that they did in helping us continue to provide those essential services. We provided infectious disease leave and child care services for employees, particularly those that were still having to come into work because they were essential employees and the schools were closed, so they had no place to bring their children to. We've worked cooperatively with Clark County to open the isolation and quarantine facility at Cashman Center to support our homeless community. Continuing on to the next slide. We've implemented a hiring freeze. We already had gone through about 18 months of freezing vacant positions as they opened up and had frozen a number of positions and saved about $8 million in last year's budget in kind of looking forward at how to solve the structural budget deficit. We've re-implemented that hiring freeze and have pretty much frozen every position that's become vacant this fiscal year as well. We began concession bargaining. As we talked about earlier today, during your earlier presentations, we've helped the business community out, as well as our residents, by deferring payments and waiving penalties for things like sewer fees and business licenses. We've set up our customer service and payment center located across the street and our parking garage on the first floor there. That's helping us provide better service and a more efficient way of operating. We've identified available federal and state grant funding. Ted gave you an update on where we're at with that, and I'll have a little bit of information about the CARES Act monies and how we're using those in my presentation as well. And then we've moved into the reopening phase, and we've developed reopening plans. Looking more specifically, unfortunately, it's not only the general fund that's being impacted by the economic effects of this pandemic. Just to give you a quick overview, these are some of the funds that are seeing economic implications associated with the pandemic. I'm going to talk mostly about the general fund, but in the general fund, we're seeing lower consolidated tax receipts, lower licenses and franchise receipts, lower amounts of fines and charges for services, as well as other revenues. The general fund decline in revenues is estimated to be about $179 million over the course of the rest of this fiscal year and next fiscal year, and that decline will continue on, and additional monies will be needed to balance future year budgets as well. In our parking enterprise fund, because of the reduced desire to come downtown and to park in these garages that have paid parking, as well as on our streets that have meters, we're seeing reduced parking and citation revenues. About $6 million is the estimated decline in revenues in that area. In the redevelopment agency area, there's a couple things going on. One is redevelopment agency is funded by tax increment property taxes. Those taxes are still okay for now, but typically property taxes lag the rest of the economy. So next year or the year after, if the housing market does take a decline or the commercial real estate market takes a decline, we may see a hit there. There's the opportunity for people to submit to the county assessor what's called revenue-based reassessment requests. And if some of those go through, like they did last time during the Great Recession, there could be a major decline in revenues for the redevelopment agency. We also have a partnership which we formed a couple years ago with LVCVA and Fremont Street Experience to, it was a public-private partnership to jointly fund the replacement of the canopy, which is a great project. It really turned out well. LVCVA paid cash for their share of the project. The city and Fremont Street Experience financed their portion of the project. And so as we go on now and both parties, in fact, have less revenues coming in, it may be more challenging to make those debt service payments. Our Performing Arts Center, years ago we issued bonds that are supported by the car rental tax. Our estimates are that for the next couple of years we'll see a decline of about $5 million in car rental tax, as obviously people have stopped renting cars because they're not coming to town to enjoy some of the things that they come to town for. Motor vehicle fuel tax, we get two real ways that we receive this money. We receive a direct allocation, which we're estimating to be down about $3 million over the course of the next 2 years. We also receive through the regional partners about a significant amount that helps us fund various transportation projects. That pot of money is expected to be down about $300 million over the course of the next few years. Our share of that typically is about a quarter, so we're expecting to be about $75 million of less projects that we'll be able to fund over the course of the next decade or so. Our parking garage, we formed a TID to build the parking garages at Symphony Park. That's funded by the TID sales tax, which is largely generated by the Factory North Outlet Mall. The Outlet Mall was closed for a couple months, and so we're expecting to see revenues drop of about $1 million that was used towards the debt service payments on those bonds. Our Building and Safety Enterprise Fund, we are expecting to see reduced permit revenues. We don't know yet exactly how much they might go down by. Again, that kind of depends on what happens here in the development community and how quickly we can reopen business and get people interested in coming back into town. And then lastly, the LVCVA shares a portion of the RIM tax with us. It goes into a special revenue fund that supports parks projects. We're expecting to see about a $4 million drop. So just the items on this page, about $200 million this fiscal year and next fiscal year. Again, we think some of that's going to continue on, plus another roughly $75 million of impact in our regional gas tax monies. In Ted's presentation, he talked about the CARES Act. Just to kind of reiterate a few of the things he said and talk about how we received the money that we did. On March 27th, the CARES Act was enacted. That appropriated $150 billion to the Coronavirus Relief Fund for allocation to state and local governments. Nevada was allocated the minimum for states of $1.25 billion. The Act describes an allocation formula whereby 45% of the per capita monies available would be available as a direct allocation to cities and other local government entities that had a population of 500,000 or more. The City of Las Vegas, because we do have a population of 500,000 or more, we filed a certification on April 13th to receive a direct allocation, and we did in fact receive $118.9 million on April 22nd. That amount was based again on our per capita amount times 45%. So we received basically monies just based on our population, not based on the population of the county, not based on the population of the state, just based on our City of Las Vegas population that we serve. Clark County also qualified for a direct allocation. They received $295 million based on the 45% of the per capita population of Clark County, less the population of Las Vegas. So they pulled out the population of Las Vegas from the county's population and gave Clark County their share based on the per capita of the entire population of the county, less the population of Las Vegas. The state of Nevada received the difference, $836 million. That's based on the 55% of the population of Clark County, because we got the 45%, the state got the 55%. Plus the state received 100% of the per capita amount for the rest of the state outside of Clark County. In terms of what we are intending to do with the $118.9 million, this slide kind of shows you how we're intending to use it. We're hoping to use it this fiscal year. As Ted described, there's a set of guidelines that came out from U.S. Treasury that talk about what you can and cannot use the monies for, as well as a subsequent set of frequently asked questions that continued to be revised and expanded upon by U.S. Treasury as the days and weeks have gone by. Primarily, through the eligible uses of the monies, we're planning to keep our public safety services going. And so one of the intended uses of the monies is to basically allow governments to keep their operations going, in particular operations that are directly responding to the COVID-19 virus. Obviously, our public safety employees are all responding to the COVID-19 virus. And in fact, Treasury put out a specific frequently asked question that presumes that all public safety costs during this period are directly related to providing services related to the virus. So that amounts to about $97 million over this 4-month period through the rest of this fiscal year. Also charging a portion of our non-public safety payroll. Again, we have other staff throughout the city that have been doing work related to the virus. For example, homelessness efforts, sanitizing the streets, dealing with that population to make sure that they're safe and that they can continue on with their lives. We're looking to have to spend some of the money on making facility improvements as we reopen our city facilities. We'll be doing things to make sure that there's social distancing, that we put up some plexiglass and keep people safe. And so those types of improvements we're roughly estimating at this point are going to be about $3 million. We're purchasing personal protective equipment, about $500,000 so far. We'll be doing some testing of city employees. We don't know exactly how much that's going to cost, but we put in a $1 million estimate on this slide. The operations of the isolation quarantine center, again, I mentioned that was a partnership with Clark County. The county paid for the capital costs, and I believe they're being reimbursed through their CARES Act monies. We're paying for the operating costs associated with that facility that I believe will be open through the end of this current calendar quarter, at the end of June. Estimating about $2 million for those costs. And then that leaves about $5 million of the monies that we'll be using for other types of things. Earlier you heard about the $4 million business assistance program. So that's one of the primary uses for that money. We're excited that we'll be able to assist about 1,000 businesses with $4,000 grants through that program. This basically outlines for you the budget timeline. This is again, not our typical budget, but we do typically take about 5 to 6 months to put together a city budget. That typically kicks off in December or January with a meeting of what we call here it's called the Financial Oversight Committee. I think we typically call it the Financial Advisory Committee. We bring in the regional's preeminent economists, we bring in some of the hoteliers, we bring in our finance staff, and we sit down, we look at our revenue estimates for the coming year and our 5-year forecast, and they give us advice and thoughts about how the economy is expected to perform. And so later in this presentation, I'm going to show you how much has changed since we had that meeting in January. At that meeting in January, the economy was going well, and we were having a very good fiscal year, and you'll see the estimates that we came up with that were blessed by those economists and those hoteliers at that time, and how much they've changed just in the last 4 months. We had our department kickoff presentation in January. We had the departments put together their department budgets, and they presented those to the city manager's office in late February. Then the first case of the COVID-19 virus happened, the first confirmed case being on March 5th here in the Valley. We immediately commenced ongoing meetings to discuss the fiscal impacts and how to respond to those. We held meetings with each of the departments to talk about their budget submittals. Then on March 12th, the governor declared a state of emergency, followed by your state of emergency declaration, Mayor, a few days later. The departments were then asked to prepare decrement plans as opposed to what they were planning to do and what they had submitted previously, which were ways to expand their budgets. They now were going back, throwing out those expansion plans and putting in place instead decrement plans. Because of the council's priorities, we asked each of the departments to submit decrements. We asked public safety departments to submit 10% decrements, and we asked the other city departments to submit 20% decrements. On April 15th, we were still involved in trying to figure out how to put together a smart, balanced budget, and so we submitted the tentative budget to the state at that time. Again, this budget is nothing like the tentative budget because we now have taken fully into account all of the changes that we have to make to balance the budget moving forward. On May 2nd, we put together a budget that included decrements. We shared that with you in some of your council briefings. Those budgets have now been revised to include the allowable uses of the CARE Act funds. We held a budget workshop a week or so ago and went through the proposed budget with each of you in small work groups. And then today we're having what's required by the state, which is a final budget hearing, and we will be required to submit the final budget to the state on June 1st. Talking more specifically about general fund revenues, we are using the most recent economic projections from the regional economists. First up, consolidated tax. For fiscal year 20, the economists are actually expecting that we're going to see a decrease this fiscal year, this is just for basically the 4-month period, about 8.7% as compared to fiscal year 2019. And in fiscal year 21, we're going to see an additional 19.8% drop. That's over 30% decrease, and we do expect it's going to take about 3 to 4 years probably to get back to the level we were at in fiscal year 19. Property taxes, as I mentioned earlier, is a lagging revenue source, so the revenue for next year is based on assessed valuation as of January 1st of this year, so the assessor closes the rolls. That includes the assessed value of properties that had been either in place or were built in the last fiscal year, or the last calendar year. That assessed value increase has been disclosed to us at 5.3% for next fiscal year. Under property tax laws, there is caps and secondary caps. Based on those cap laws, the city would receive a tax increase of 3% on residential property and 3.6% on non-residential property, in addition to some increase based on new taxes that roll on based on new construction that took place during that calendar year. We do have about $42.8 million of abated property tax under state law, and I'll show you in the property tax slide later what that is important, why that is important to us. And we are seeing other kinds of declines in other revenue sources as well. In the licenses and franchise category, we're expecting to see a decrease this year of 7.6%. That'll be followed hopefully by a small increase next year, but not getting back to the level that it was at prior to COVID-19. In the fines and charges for services and other revenues areas, we're going to see decreases this fiscal year and next of about 4% each year, both fiscal years being impacted. And then the last bullet on this slide, contributions from the redevelopment agency are expected to continue. They make a small contribution each year to help cover the cost of maintenance in the project areas that they serve. Looking at a couple of bar charts, this first one is the consolidated tax history from fiscal year 2007 to the projection for fiscal year 2021. And a couple of things to point out here. During this period of time, we're now seeing two rather dramatic declines. First, during the Great Recession period, at the left side of the chart, you saw a decline from $263 million in fiscal year 7 to a dip of $201.5 million in fiscal year 10. That was a $61.7 million or 23% decrease. It then took 9 years to get back to the level that it was at in fiscal year 2007. That was commonly called the recovery period that really didn't happen. It was very stagnant, very slow. But eventually we got there and we started to have a couple of pretty good years. And so you see that C-Tax was up to $323 million as our actual for fiscal year 19. During the course of fiscal year 20 and 21, though, we're expecting to see that drop from that high by $86.8 million, or 27%, which is an even greater decline than what we saw during the Great Recession. So the question then becomes, how many years will it take to get back to the level we were at in fiscal year 19? Based on talking to the economists, we think it's probably 3 years. Hopefully it will not be longer than that. This next slide talks about property tax, and you'll see that the bars are divided into two pieces. The lower or yellow piece of the bar is the amount of tax that we actually collect. The top or green piece is the amount of abated tax under state law. So if somebody sees a decline in their property value, it doesn't necessarily translate to a decline in the amount of tax that they have to pay if there's been a tax abatement. And a tax abatement comes onto the roll because your property value may be increasing faster than the amount of the tax under the caps. So if your cap was 2% 1 year, but your value went up by 5%, the difference would be abated tax that would be put onto the assessment roll, but not taxed on your tax bill. So that's the green pieces of the bars, and so you see that tax did increase before the Great Recession, and then during the Great Recession, as the assessed values were going down dramatically, the abated tax went away, but we did see a real dollar decline in the amount of tax that we collected of $46.5 million over that 4 or 5 year period. It was about a 35% decrease. And unlike C-Tax, we actually have not gotten back, even 12 years later, to the levels of property tax that we were at before the Great Recession hit. We're sitting now at about $16.8 million with next year's projection below the level of property tax that we collected in fiscal year 2009. So 12 years later, we're still almost 10% below where we were 12 years earlier. This next slide, as I mentioned, kind of shows what has changed just in the 4 months since we met with our fiscal advisory group. We met with them. They gave us their thoughts on our estimates at that time in January. These are displayed in the top half of this chart. I know it's probably kind of hard to read on the screen, so I'll just cover a couple of the highlights. We were actually expecting, based on having a good first half of fiscal year 2020, that we were going to see about a $23 million increase in general fund revenues as compared to fiscal year 19. And in fiscal year 21, we were expecting at that time to see about another $15 million increase as compared to fiscal year 20. And then you see at the bottom half of this chart what our current projections are for those same revenue sources based on what's happened with the pandemic. Our latest projections are that fiscal year 20 will instead be about $55 million less than what was estimated just 4 months ago, and fiscal year 21 will be about $124 million less than what was estimated, and blessed by that, the area's preeminent economists just 4 months ago. $123 million, $124 million for fiscal year 21, plus the 55 for fiscal year 22. That's the $179 million drop that I mentioned on the earlier slide for general fund revenues. This slide shows you how our mix of revenues is for the general fund. The two largest slices on the right side here is consolidated tax. This shows 42.9% of our overall revenue projection, and property tax at the bottom in orange shows 21.4% of our overall revenue projection for next fiscal year. The consolidated tax amount every year I've been here has been over 50%, so this shows you how much consolidated tax has dropped, such that the slice of the pie that it represents is now less than 50% by almost 7%. These two together are about 64% of general fund revenues for next fiscal year. Typically, that's a little bit higher. Last year, we saw a 54% slice for C-Tax and 18% for property tax, so we were 72% last year, and this year the two of them together are 64%. So therefore, we've had to take a number of actions to try to figure out how to balance our budget. First up, the first major bullet here talks about decrements. As I mentioned, we asked each of the departments to submit decrements as part of the budget process this year. Those are divided out into wage and benefit decrements and non-labor decrements. On the wages and benefits side, $48.4 million is included in this year's budget. That breaks down into, $48.4 million is a total. Wages and benefits portion of that was $26.1 million. That breaks down into frozen positions of about $7 million. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been holding positions vacant and freezing positions now for at least 2 years. And so this is on top of about $8 million of positions that we had frozen and already eliminated from the fiscal year 20 budget. So really, over the course of the last 2 years, we're unfunding about $15 million worth of positions. One thing to point out is it has always been our approach to make layoffs a last recourse. So we've been, I think, working diligently towards that effort by holding these vacant positions vacant so that nobody loses their job. And so we're working very hard to make sure that continues to happen as best that we can. In addition to the frozen positions, we did transfer some positions to other funds, and we've moved some of those people into positions that they otherwise might not have done. Some of the funds we moved into the YDSI, there's the education set-aside monies there, into the community services area where we have additional grants coming in, at least for the next fiscal year, into the sanitation fund, into facilities funds, into the fleets fund. We've moved some people out of the general fund to try to make the general fund solvent moving forward. And then we've also gone through and reduced our overtime and hourly budgets, another $13 million there. On the non-labor side, we took what I would call a very detailed look at all of our non-labor expenditures. In the services and supplies area, we cut $7.3 million. That was primarily contract services, professional services, and other accounts. I'd like to thank some of the council members for their assistance on helping us go through those contracts and take a look at those in more detail. We also have had what I would describe as a very good partnership with Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Both the county and the city are major funders of the police department. The police department was able to reduce their budget ask for next fiscal year by $15 million. They did that primarily by eliminating some previously requested additional positions, holding some positions vacant, and deferring capital purchases, at least for the next year or two. So that's been very helpful in helping us build a balanced budget for next year. And then last on this slide, I'm going to be talking more later about it, but we have set aside money into what we're calling a fiscal stabilization fund, and later in today's session, we're going to ask you to officially create that fund and authorize the monies going into it, and then authorize the monies that'll be coming out of it to help us balance next year's budget as well as budgets going forward. In fiscal year 20, we're putting monies aside to put into that fund so that we can help balance the budget for fiscal year 21. And so you see a number here, $32.6 million is money coming back to the general fund from that fiscal stabilization fund. And that's really the two main ways that we're balancing the budget for next fiscal year. First, through decrements, and second, through that fiscal stabilization fund. Unfortunately, even though we had tried to keep everything else flat in the budget, there were some areas of expansion or additional monies that we had to set aside in next year's budget that there was no way to avoid. In the general fund, we had to add $3.8 million, primarily contractual obligations and things that we had to do. In the contractual obligation area, we have a contract with the Animal Foundation. That's a joint contract with North Las Vegas and the county. Our share of that contribution was up by $329,000. We also operate a regional fire communications center. There's additional costs that you'll see on the next slide there. And so our share of that additional cost is $600,000 next fiscal year. Software maintenance costs, these are multi-year agreements that had escalators built into them, $271,000 of additional cost. Also, as part of the mayor's fund, we're wanting to make sure that our donors are able to get the full value of their donations. And so it was agreed earlier this year that the city would pick up the administrative costs of operating that mayor's fund, and so that 100% of the donations that people donate go directly to projects. Every other year, we do have lobbying expenses associated with the state legislative session. Next year is the on year for this legislative session. So we, in the off year, we don't have this money in the budget. In the on year, we have this money in the budget. So $80,000 for lobbying expenses for next year. The homeless courtyard professional services contract is a contract that you approved several council meetings ago, $1.9 million for its operations next fiscal year. And then lastly on this list, continuing to fund our legal defense associated with the Badlands litigation, $500,000 for next fiscal year.
Excuse me, is that $500,000 on that, that's for 2021 only?
Mayor, that's the estimated cost of what we needed to add to the budget for 2021 only.
On top of what we already had in?
On top of what we already had budgeted and allocated toward that. We don't know how much of it we're going to spend. We're hoping to spend as little as possible, but we do need to defend the city. I don't know if any of the city attorneys want to comment on that.
Jeff Dorkek, Deputy City Attorney. Yeah, that'll be $500,000 for FY21. I don't believe it obviously includes the money approved at the last meeting for Shoot Mahali, correct, Gary?
I don't think so, because that was this
Right.
fiscal year.
So it is, as Gary mentioned, we'll attempt to use as little of that as possible, but it is $500,000, and per the council's direction last meeting, we're continuing with the firms that we have, but attempting to get the monies down. So obviously, we're not going to guarantee that we aren't going to need additional money through the year to defend the city in those matters, but we're definitely going to do everything we can to keep the costs down.
Mr. Dorkak, then where, if in fact that there's a necessity to increase that, have you had discussions where that fund, where are those funds going to come from?
Madam Mayor, whenever that happens, we look to Gary and hope he's got some in the fund.
Do you have a secret hiding place for funds?
We don't have a secret hiding place, but we do have general fund reserves, and we are also putting together this fiscal stabilization fund. So we also have a city liability fund, and so the liability fund has reserves as well.
Okay.
So there's a couple areas that we can look to make those adjustments if we did need to spend more than what we're talking about budgeting.
So is this this number, this 500,000 for that, for Badlands litigation, is an average number, a generous number, or a low-end number?
Frankly, obviously, it would be a low-end number. It was part of our plan that didn't come to fruition in terms of moving some of the counsel to one law firm. So the 500,000 would have come from a situation that we did not take, but the finance department was able to keep that money in the budget. So we're hoping that 500,000 goes as far as it can, and then we will supplement as needed after.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, question?
So I just want to clarify, because we had four different law firms, and we were keeping one and letting 3 go. And did we do that? Did we fire them yet?
We are no longer working with Colasar and Latham. I believe we've let Leonard Law know that they will also be no longer needed. We are in communications at the direction of the council with McDonald Carano. And who else is there? That's pretty much all of them. Yeah, so we're, without getting into any type of litigation
Right.
discussion, just on the financial side like we're doing now, that's where we are. But we are moving in that direction to consolidate costs.
Thank you so much, Mr.
And I'd like to add, just keep going at you, Mr. Dorkak, what is the general number in our legal team that are assigned to this litigation? In-house, I'm talking.
We currently have our senior litigation counsel, Phil Burns, leading the operation. Seth Floyd's our deputy city attorney. I don't know if we've done any recent breakdown in terms of hours and calculating that, but obviously all of their, or a majority of their efforts is going towards the in-house operation of this, and that's been what we've been doing, and it'll increase as we remove some of the firms and attempt to bring more and more in-house.
And is this number inclusive of their work hours?
No, ma'am.
Mayor, their time is budgeted like the other wages and benefits in the general fund, so their hourly time is budgeted as part of the general fund's
Okay,
wages and
good,
benefits.
that's
fund.
good.
Okay, so as we go forth, I mean, we've got a lot of changes coming about. We've got a new city attorney that will be swearing in soon. And I just want to ask that our management and you guys keep on the radar to maybe bring this in-house. Maybe once the new city attorney gets settled in, maybe he brings an attorney in-house just for this particular case. And that's conversations that I've had with Councilwoman Seaman. So I really shouldn't be voicing what you said, but that's kind of what I got from you.
Direction noted.
Yes, and just to add, this is why I think what we're going through, we did not expect to go through the COVID, and this has been a priority to try to settle this, and bringing it in-house, I think, will cut costs, and I'm just going to reiterate what Mayor Pro Tem said here.
Thank you, Mr. Ameling.
Thank you. So moving on to some of the other funds that we're having to expand for next fiscal year, the youth development area, we're adding $91,000 primarily for the Strong Start Go program. In fire communications, I mentioned this is the regional dispatch services that we provide with other partners throughout the valley, $1.2 million increase for next fiscal year. And then in the city facilities area, we're having to pay additional higher utility costs associated with our facilities and other contractual obligations of $175,000. So again, this is an extremely small amount of enhancements to the budget as compared to what a typical budget year would be. Looking at the general fund budget in two different ways, in two different pie charts. This first pie chart shows you general fund expenditures by function. Our budget estimate for next fiscal year is $571.8 million. At the bottom here, you'll see that the largest share by far is public safety costs at a little bit over 2/3 of the general fund budget. The public safety cost slice does include the amount of money that we pay to Metro each year. So with our public safety departments in-house plus Metro's budget, that's a little bit more than 2/3 of our overall city budget. Looking at it by
I have a
category.
question, Madam Mayor.
I'm sorry.
I have a question. Regarding the budget, when you go back to Public Works and all of our capital expense that we have, I got a list of all of our outstanding CapEx that is requested and needed. How do we decide what prioritization of capital expenditures will be allotted within 2021 budget? And is that indicated, would that be under Public Works?
So these slides that I'm going through right now are our general fund budget. We have some slides later on the capital program.
So the
but,
capital
I think Jorge Cervantes could talk about the allocation process and how we prioritize projects when we come to those slides, if you still have that question.
Okay, but within this particular slide,
This would be where the operations side would be, so the public works engineers that work on those capital projects
Yep.
would be shown here.
Okay.
But the actual capital cost of the projects is in the capital program.
so this is just the actual labor for that?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
So looking now at the general fund expenditures by category instead of by function, you can see that the largest portion of our budget goes towards salary and benefit costs. This is typical for a city general fund. In fact, most cities have their own police department. So here on this slide, you'll see that Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department is shown as a separate slice along the top left side in light gray. If you added in the roughly 85% of their budget that goes towards salary and benefit costs, with the 53% of our regular budget that goes towards salary and benefit costs, about 3/4 of our budget, therefore, would then be salary and benefit costs. And that 3/4 is pretty typical for a city general fund budget. This next slide highlights for you the general fund budget actuals for fiscal year 19, estimated year end for fiscal year 20, and then the budget that we're recommending for fiscal year 21. I won't highlight all the numbers on this slide, but just to highlight a few of them, along the top row there, you'll see our consolidated tax numbers. Again, we're seeing dramatic declines in consolidated tax for this fiscal year and next fiscal year as compared to fiscal year 19, which came in at $323.8 million. So that is now our new high number for moving forward to compare to moving forward to see how well we can come back to that number.
A question here on the second line. Knowing the condition of finances throughout the state, I would imagine it is possible that there would be a special session called, and since there aren't too many sources of income, if in fact there were the legislative move to increase property tax, do you see that coming in to affect fiscal year 2021 or further out?
Mayor, I would see that it would probably not impact fiscal year '21 because the roles have already been set for next fiscal year, so it would be very difficult at this point to change the property tax assessments that have now, I think, just getting ready to be billed out by the county tax offices throughout the state. A property tax change is difficult in state law, and it requires I think 2 years' worth of votes. I don't know if Ted can comment on that, but it takes a good bit of effort to change property tax law in the state. There's certainly been some efforts to change property tax laws over the last several sessions, but it hasn't gone through because it's just so difficult to do.
Can I turn to legal on that? State law would require 2 votes 2 separate times. If there were a special session called and the only source of income that was seen at the legislature would be here comes Ted with the answer. Would it be 2 annual votes by the public to increase property tax, or can they just mandate it through a special session and implement it over a 2-year period?
You have to change the Constitution, though, right? Mayor, we can certainly get back to you on what would
Okay,
be the
that's
steps
fine.
involved in doing that, but
Sorry.
it's certainly a possibility that they could call a special session, but I've heard of no conversations about increasing
Okay.
property taxes.
But if in fact my main thing is it does not, if that were to occur, and if in fact there were a movement in the legislature and the executive branch to go ahead and increase property tax, it takes two-time votes by the public, does it not? And then it would be, but the big thing is 2021 will not be affected.
We don't believe so.
Okay.
The one
And so
thing-
could you just get that clarification? I
Yes,
think
yes.
it's 2 votes of the
For
public.
the record, Ted Oliva's Chief of Staff. Yes, they can do a special session. Do we believe that it will affect the FY21 revenues? No, it won't be there in time to help us there. They could always look at property tax and other things.
Right.
And so there's a lot on the table, as you were kind of alluding to.
So could you get just back to us all with a quick email that, I'm looking at the second line here. So my big question was 2021, no effect no matter what happens. But if in fact it comes forward, a special session is called and it is voted upon positively to increase just property tax, nothing else, they could do that too. Does it take 2 votes of the public to validate and approve that?
Typically it does.
So if you could just get back to me on that, please.
Yes,
Or else
absolutely. I'll get
please.
with Jeff and the city attorney's
Okay,
office.
but the
just to
main
be
thing is
perfectly clear.
2021, this is it. Okay. thank
And Mayor, if I could just add to that, I'm actually more worried that they're going to do something that reduces our property tax as opposed to something that increases our property tax. We are seeing potentially another impact on the housing market here in the Valley associated with the economic downturn associated with this virus. They may need money at the state level to fund schools. If they can't get enough federal money, they may look to reallocate existing revenue sources. So we're concerned about that. We're obviously keeping our eye on the ball to make sure that we do whatever we can so that they don't do that impacts negatively our revenues, because we need our revenues to provide services for our residents and stakeholders here in the
Well,
city.
and of course, too, reiterating what's been said here, I do see an increase in giving up housing, getting back perhaps into foreclosure issues as a result of all of this. But my biggest concern was for 2021, in this budget that's being proposed, those things will not affect any change at the legislature. This time, that. Okay,
That's my
thank you.
understanding. You will see on our next slide when we talk about our 5-year forecast that we already had been predicting a slowdown in property taxes, and so we are still predicting that slowdown in property taxes, but it's in fiscal year '22, not in fiscal year '21.
Perfect,
And
thank
then,
you.
as I mentioned earlier, in the redevelopment agency area, which has most of the commercial properties, at least the larger ones in the city, as part of their tax increment, property tax monies that they receive, there is the ability under state law for those properties that are income-based assessments, for them to go to the county assessor and request an income-based reassessment based on the fact that they have much lower revenue coming in during this time period. They may qualify for those reassessments, and that reassessment, if it comes in lower, could impact those tax increment property taxes moving forward. And that reassessment, from the way I understand the tax law here, is it's a permanent reassessment. So we're still seeing the impacts from the last Great Recession, which is why we've never gotten back to that property tax level we were at before the Great Recession.
Okay.
The other area that property tax could be impacted moving forward is that tax cap formula. There's a component of that in the secondary cap that's based on change in prices. And so as the CPI potentially is very low because of the downturn, we could see very small increases, or in fact even no increases moving forward in our property tax collections, potentially.
So you're projecting out on that?
We
Okay,
are.
thank you. Thank you.
So just a couple numbers to highlight on this slide. In the line called transfers in from other funds, in fiscal year 20, that is where we're going to be transferring in monies to the general fund from the federal CARES Act monies funds. You set up a separate special revenue fund for that money in your previous session. That's going to all go into that fund, and then to help support the general fund for the services that I mentioned earlier that are eligible, we would be transferring money to the general fund, and then down the end of that column, you'll see transfer out to other funds. That is us funding up the fiscal stabilization fund to set aside monies to help us through next fiscal year and fiscal year 21, as well as help us through fiscal year 22 and maybe even other years as well. In the fiscal year 21 column, you'll see again a much lower estimate for consolidated tax. You'll see a transfer in from other funds. That's money coming back to the general fund from the fiscal stabilization fund to be able to balance the budget for fiscal year 21. I mentioned earlier $34.6 million. That's the amount that we would need to bring back from fiscal stabilization to get to a balance point, even with the decrements that we had to implement. And so we always take that projection for the next fiscal year and we move it forward into a 5-year projection for 5 years beyond the budget year. And so this projection, as shown on this slide, is for fiscal years 22 through 26. And a couple things to point out here. For those fiscal years, we are assuming that the concessions that we're going to get from bargaining units are going to help us balance the budget for fiscal year 22. We are assuming, though, that beyond fiscal year 21, that there would be what would be typically seen as COLAs for staff for the years beyond. And we're also assuming that the decrements that we're implementing this year would continue throughout this forecast period, and that the frozen positions that we're having to freeze this year would continue throughout this forecast period, just to see if we could afford to potentially bring back some of those service levels in these later years. Unfortunately, this forecast shows that we still have a structurally unbalanced budget, and that's primarily due to the expenditure growth rates, again, being faster than the revenue growth rates. So even with coming out of the economic downturn here and seeing C-tax growth grow back, it shows that we would get back to the level we were at last year in fiscal year 23, so it would take basically 4 years to get back to where we were in C-tax. Even with transferring money into fiscal year 22 to help it balance of $14 million there in the fiscal year 22 column, we still have a problem moving forward. We're projecting deficits each year, shown in red in the yellow line at the bottom, for fiscal years 23 through fiscal year 26. So we still have some more work to do to try to figure out how to balance our budgets moving forward. And obviously, since our budget is 75% or so salary and benefits, the solutions, unfortunately, to a large degree depend on either finding ways to increase revenues or finding ways to decrease our salary and benefit cost growth rate. I mentioned earlier that we're going to be talking also about some of our other funds, and so the next couple of slides talk about our capital improvement plan. This is the piece of the capital improvement plan, of the 5-year capital improvement plan that will be for fiscal year 21. We do have some dedicated funding sources that help support capital projects. A few of them are listed here: the 5-cent ad valorem tax, the 1% room tax, community development block grant program monies, and our residential construction tax. We also look every year at reallocating any cost savings from existing projects. As we close them out, there might be some monies left over, so that helps us typically seed a fund that we can use then to help provide funding for new projects. This year, we're not able to send any money to the capital projects fund from the general fund. We typically like to send over money each year to help fund capital projects. In fact, I think you could argue that we need to send over at least $5 million typically to the capital projects to fund projects that don't otherwise have their own dedicated funding sources. So it's unfortunate that in fiscal year 21 we won't be able to put any money aside for capital projects. But we did have a little bit of money left over in other areas from other funding sources, and so we're going to be funding a few projects. This next slide shows you Some of the projects that are absolutely necessary that we fund, we need to replace some fire apparatus, $3.2 million, some fire equipment, $2.4 million, fire rescue equipment, $1.3 million, and some technology security and upgrade costs of $1.5 million. In total, we've identified about $10.4 million of monies to allocate. These do not include the regional monies that we get through our regional partners that are listed here, RTC, the Flood Control District, and NDOT, which provide us funding for those types of projects that those restricted monies are used for. In terms of the $10.4 million, 7.7 would go towards public safety projects, 1.2 million towards facilities projects, and $1.5 million towards technology projects. A total of 18 new projects will be funded. I believe we sent you each an allocation of each of those new projects. And then our 5-year capital program, this is where the regional funding really shows how important that is to us. The 5-year capital program would be $1.2 billion rather, and that's for the projects that are dedicated from the regional funding sources over the next 5 years, as well as the carry forward projects that have been underway but haven't yet spent the allocations from previous fiscal years. Looking at our redevelopment agency, we have seen good growth in assessed valuation over the last couple of years. The growth that's been told to us by the county assessor for next fiscal year is 5.2% on the assessed valuation side. That translates into a tax increment revenue growth of 5.5%. The redevelopment agency would be continuing efforts towards the marketing of the medical district, Symphony Park development. EUD will be working on emergency funding assistance for small businesses. We talked about programs there in the earlier presentations. We still have some new market tax credit monies from our previous allocations to allocate out, as well as an application that's in for the next round of allocations when that does come down. We're going to be making the contribution to the city of $2 million for next fiscal year towards maintenance of the redevelopment project areas. We'll be continuing to work on City Hall Park development for the land we bought across the street next to the new municipal court building. And then we're continuing our efforts in the Innovation District and the International Innovation Center. I'm working on our Smart Cities Technology and Innovation projects at the Bank of America building, the Fifth Street School, and the library. This next slide, like we did for the general fund, shows you the actuals for fiscal year 19, the year-end estimates for fiscal year 20, and then the projected budget for fiscal year 21. One thing I will point out, fiscal year 19 and 20 really were not typical RDA budgets. They were affected by the Canopy project, and so you'll see in the other contributions line there were rather large numbers in fiscal year 19 and 20. That was the money coming in from LVCVA, as well as the money coming in from the bond issue that we did to pay for the Canopy project. And then down in the program expense line, you'll see rather large numbers in 19 and 20 as well. That was the expenditure of paying the contractors to construct and install the canopy. So fiscal year 21 I actually would describe as a more normal year for the RDA. And so you'll see there that we have revenues of about $22.6 million and expenditures of about $25.7 million that we are budgeting for next fiscal year. I mentioned earlier the Fiscal Stabilization Fund as part of today's agenda. Agenda item 6 on your docket requests the creation of a Fiscal Stabilization Fund. This will be a special revenue fund to provide for the stabilization of operations during periods of economic downturn or for the mitigation of effects of a disaster. We're seeding it with some monies that we're able to find in looking at balances in other funds as a starting balance. We came up with about $24.5 million. You can see the breakout, what funds we were able to find that money in. Print Media Internal Service Fund, about $600,000. The Computer Services Internal Service Fund, about $400,000. The Automotive Operations Internal Service Fund, about $2 million. The Employee Benefits Fund, about $13 million. The General Capital Projects Fund, through the cancellation of several capital projects, $5 million. And then the General Fund, from land sale proceeds that are coming in from the sale of the old transportation center site, $3.5 million. So that $24.5 million is our starting money for this Fiscal Stabilization Fund. Also in your packet, you'll see a resolution that creates that fund. This, because it's a special revenue fund that needs to be established in a certain way, it has to have a dedicated revenue source. So we are recommending in that resolution that we allocate 0.1% of our property tax monies each year into that fund as a dedicated revenue source, and that the expenditures from this fund would be used only to stabilize operations during times of economic events or natural disasters. Looking at fiscal years 20 and 21, you see the $24.5 million as the starting balance there during this fiscal year. We also are going to be transferring in monies from the general fund. I mentioned that earlier on the general fund slide. That'll get us up to about $90 million in this fund at the end of this fiscal year. That is really important because that will help us get through the next 2 fiscal years at least. In fiscal year 21, we would then need to transfer $32.6 million to the general fund to help maintain services there. And that's in addition, again, to having to take all those decrements and hold all those positions vacant. And then that would leave about $57.9 million available to help support fiscal year 22, as well as to help support some of those other funds that I described earlier that may have needs because of the declines in revenues of those other funds as well. So that'll be a request that you'll hopefully take action on as part of your actions today. And then lastly, we're asking you to also create a customer service payment center internal service fund. This is agenda item 7 on your docket this afternoon. This internal service fund would provide for a centralized service area where citizens may call with questions or complaints and receive current information about city activities and services, as well as make payments. This customer center and payment center is already up and operating across the street at our city garage. It's in the first floor there, and customers can come in during normal operations as well as on Fridays and Saturdays. We have hours, I believe, that are basically 7 to 7 during the week. And so that is a great new way of providing service to our customers. It's something that we didn't have before. We were very decentralized. Customers had to come into City Hall and then disperse across several different floors to do payment business, for example, or to ask questions of different departments. We've now consolidated that into one centralized service. It's a more efficient way to go about providing that service, and so we're setting up an internal service fund by this action so that we can allocate out those costs to the different funds that are going to be benefiting from that service.
Excuse me, on that service center fund, no cash or cash? I mean, you said operating 24/7?
No, operating additional hours beyond what we normally operate here at City Hall, so they'll be open
Fridays.
the normal 4 days that we're open here at City Hall, Monday through Thursday, but they'll also be open on Fridays, and they also are going to have Saturday hours as well.
Okay. And so just knowing issues that we have with all different kinds of issues, are they credit card or online payment only?
They do. We've moved very heavily, as most businesses have, towards online payment opportunities for the public as well as our business community. Actually, most of our sewer service customers are now paying online. We're also seeing a big interest in online payments from the development community as well. So a lot of the activities associated with payments are now taking place online, but people can still call up this center and ask for help about a number of things and make online payments, phone payments. They can come in and make in-person payments. And so there's a lot of opportunities for people to get help.
Great. And what, do you have an annual cost to operating that center, and how many persons have to be in there? I mean, what is your overall cost?
I may have to get back to you on that. It's
Okay.
part of the internal service fund budget that you'll see on the next slide.
Okay.
So we have several internal service funds. This will be a new internal service fund, but basically it's going to be lower cost than what we've been spending in the past because, again, we were operating in a decentralized way. So we think we had about 25 to 30 city staff in a decentralized approach working on various pieces of this service. And instead of that, we're going to have about a dozen staff dedicated in one centralized location. So it's going to allow us, through attrition, to be able to either reallocate some of those employees to other areas, or eventually when those people leave the city, then we'd be able to eliminate some of those positions and have additional savings.
Excellent. Thank you.
So in wrapping it up, and I apologize for how long the presentation has taken, but this is obviously a very important budget for the city. This is our overall summary of the total city budget. Again, you'll see fiscal year 19 column, a fiscal year-end estimate for fiscal year 20 column, and then the total budgets by fund category for fiscal year 21. The top line is the general fund. You'll see decrease from this fiscal year to next fiscal year. Again, that's largely because of the revenue drop. $572 million budget for fiscal year '21. The actual budget that you approved a year ago today, Mayor, was $44 million higher than the budget we're asking you to approve for next fiscal year. So typically our budgets go up. This coming year, the budget's going down. Special revenue funds, you may notice that fiscal year '20, there was a rather large number in that column. That was us paying off the City Hall certificates of participation bonds. So that was really a one-time event that distorted that number for that fiscal year. That's in the debt service line. In the special revenue fund line, you'll see a rather large number this fiscal year. That's for the CARES Act monies coming into the city. So that will be going into that new special revenue fund that you created at the regular session earlier today. Overall, the budget for fiscal year '21 is being asked to be approved is $1.5 billion. Last fiscal year on this same date, we asked you to approve, and you did approve a budget of $1.8 billion. So we're about $300 million or so lower than last fiscal year's budget. And with that, Mayor, there are several actions that we're asking you to approve today. These are agenda items 4, 5, 6, and 7 on your agenda. But before you take those actions, we'd be happy to answer any additional questions that you have.
Yes, please, Councilman Creel.
Thank you. So am I to understanding that when we talk about capital expenditures for next year, that you're asking us to approve the final budget with that CapEx that I mentioned earlier is involved in this budget, right?
Yes, it's
So-
the capital program line of
Yeah.
$484 million.
So I didn't get an answer to my question. The original question was what projects are incorporated in that, and then how did we decide which ones are prioritized in that? Who makes that prioritization?
So I'm going to ask Mr. Cervantes to answer that question.
Mayor, through you, this is Jorge Cervantes. Councilman, to answer your question, really when we look at projects, we look at those that follow 3 criteria. The first criteria is what is the restriction on the funding? As Gary indicated, there's several dedicated funding sources, but they have a restriction. For example, we're funding a lot of the fire services needs this year with the Medicare money. The Medicare money can only be used for fire needs, so that $7 million can only be used for that, so that's a restriction. We're funding about $1.2 million in facility improvements. That comes out of the 5-cent ad valorem tax, a dedicated funding source, which has a restriction, can only be used for city facility rehabilitation. And so we look at that first. Second thing we look at, what are those critical needs? If we have a facility that the mechanical system reached the end of life and the air conditioning system doesn't work anymore, and we need to have it up and running for summer events, a community center, then we need to replace that. And then the third criteria is what are council priorities? We hear from you what your priorities are, and we say, okay, based on priorities, let's allocate it. That list that we sent you was all the requests that came in from all the departments, and we had the ability to allocate $10 million this year, so all the money we had, the $7 million that went to public safety, the 1.2 that went to facilities, and then the 1.5 that went to really secure our IT infrastructures to make sure that we don't have a breach in our system. And so that's all the money that was available. When you look at the big number, the $484 million, the majority of that money is really the regional money that we get, the Regional Transportation Commission, Regional Flood Control. And those monies are allocated by those regional boards. Now, several of our council members here sit on those boards, and so different jurisdictions take their priorities to those boards, and those boards approve those budgets. We just carry them over through our capital budget program.
Right, so I still don't understand, though, like you sent me this list. This list has, and it's everyone's ward. These are all the capital projects that I guess have been requested moving forward. And it's a lot of projects, and it's a big number. But are you saying that none of these projects on here are going to be advanced next year? We're only going to do the fire apparatus, fire equipment, fire rescue, and information technology security upgrades?
That's correct, Councilman, because remember, these are the projects, what we send you is the projects that are funded out of general fund proceeds. And so there was only $10 million of general fund proceeds available for funding, and that money had restrictions on the use. And so we couldn't use the Medicare money to fund, say, an expansion of a recreational facility.
Right.
Because it's not permitted. And so we were limited by the money that was available, which is $10 million, and then the restrictions that came with those funds.
Okay. And so at some point then, we'll sit down and go through at least in my ward, the projects that have capital funding requests and figure out alternative ways to figure out where we're going to try to get those dollars from, if we're able to.
That's correct, Councilman.
Outside of that.
And also, there are some projects that are in process now.
Yep.
Sometimes they're multi-year process. We'll allocate the design money 1 year, and the construction money in a year, or sometimes we're short a little bit to get it out to bid. Give you an example, the Charleston Heights Park is an example. We're asking for an additional $1 million to get that project out the door. So we'll be meeting with you to see how do we still push that project forward. Is there an opportunity to rescope it a little bit different, that we can still move forward with those projects?
Gotcha. And my second question is for Gary, thank you, is that when you talk about the fiscal stabilization fund and tapping into the property taxes, if we take the dollars from that into the stabilization fund, that means that we're taking dollars away from something else? Because they aren't new dollars.
No, these are a small portion of our existing property tax money, so the resolution that's before you requires that we put 0.1% of our property tax monies, which equates to roughly $100,000 per year, into this fund as a dedicated funding source. So it would be then available, and as part of the other fund balance, it would be a funding source that would basically make this fund restricted under state law and under accounting standards. So it would show up as a separate fund. It would not be part of the general fund. It would be part of a special revenue fund category of funds.
And you only anticipate $100,000 a year from that?
Well, 0.1% is basically, we're at 113 million or something in
Right.
property tax, so it's about 100,000, 113,000.
That's why I was getting kind of confused, because when you went to the second page, you talked about $32 million, and I'm trying to understand where that came from, transfer to the...
So we had a special slide on 32 million. Let me go back to that slide. So the 32 million, I'm sorry, the 32 million, the 24 million came from these funding sources.
Right.
And then the 32 million is actually the transfer out of this fiscal stabilization fund to the general fund. So that showed up here on this slide, where you see it being transferred out in fiscal year 21. And then if we go back to the 5-year forecast slide, you'll see it coming into the general fund in a line called Transfer In Special Revenue Fund in fiscal year 21, the same $32.6 million. So that's the amount of money that we needed to balance the general fund budget. Even though we had anticipated that we would have the decrements, that we'd have some savings from concessions, we also then still needed to bring in $32.6 million to get to a balanced position.
Right. The way I saw this was that you established a fiscal stabilization fund, and it was going to generate $24.5 million.
No.
That's
so
where I
that's
didn't.
just the
That's
seed,
where I got.
That's the seed money that we're sending to the
That's what you're
stabilization
sending in.
fund.
That's not what's going to generate from the fund.
Right, it's generated from the savings in the other funds.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Except, one question, you inferred somewhere that there was concerned property tax income might go down, in which case, this 1%, or 1/10 of 1%.
So, Mayor, if the property taxes went down by 10%, and we're talking about $100,000, we would only be able to put in $90,000. So we're going to put in a percentage of our property tax, 1/10 of 1%. Whatever that generates in that fiscal year is what would be the income for this fiscal stabilization fund for that fiscal year. So you're right, it could go up and it could go down over time. It hopefully will mostly go up, but there are times when we see property taxes go down.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Just that hooked into what Councilman was mentioning. Oh, any other questions here? Yes?
Thank you. So it's not so much of a question, because I've questioned you for the past month and a half, and I just want to thank you for your patience with explaining and teaching and showing me exactly what you had to come up with for this budget. And I know it was rough, and I just want to tell you, I really thank you for helping me get through this and understand it.
Oh, you're very welcome. I mean, that's why we're here.
Okay, so guide us along further now. What would you like us with questions and?
So, Mayor, you have 4 action items today. Agenda item 4 is the budget for the city's general fund. Agenda item 5, I believe, is the budget for, I'm sorry, agenda item 4 is the budget for the city. Agenda item 5 is the budget for the redevelopment agency. Agenda item 6 is the creation of the fiscal stabilization fund. And agenda item 7 is the budget for the creation of the, special customer center fund.
Okay, so step number 1
Mayor,
is to
may I
get.
ask one question real quick?
Oh, yes, please.
Sorry, I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Ameling, for the presentation. Pursuant to my question that I asked of Mr. Olivas around the grant funding, would it be possible to send regular updates on how the COVID dollars are being spent? It's just, again, to make sure that I'm consistent with the other boards that I sit on. And I'm curious about how it's being spent and the timing of which it gets spent.
We can absolutely do that.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Mayor, if you don't mind down here, Jeff Dorkek, a couple of notes from legal. We'll need a vote on each item that's for action. In addition, I wanted to make a comment on item 7 to clarify for open meeting law purposes. We mislabeled the item in the agenda. It is the Customer Service and Payment Center Internal Services Fund.
Yes.
In the resolution, it's correct, but everywhere else around the agenda, it's incorrect. And then to your question and the council's question earlier on the property tax issue, just to save Ted an email, he and Kelly were looking it up. It's a 2/3 vote in the Assembly and the Senate. Governor's signature required to go up to $5 per $100 assessed on the home. So it wouldn't be a citizen's vote. That's the initiative process. But for the tax increase, it's 2/3 each house.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Okay, any other questions, comments? Okay, I think we're ready to get going, and we'll start with, let's see, the first one's approve the City of Las Vegas final budget, and is that in my notes here, which one to go first? Number 4. Okay, did we do the public hearing? No, we didn't. So, public hearing, anything that you have any e-correspondence? Nothing. From our public that is here and present, do we have any comments, questions? And please state your name for the record.
Yes, Your Honor. Katie Duncan, Historic West Side Chamber of Commerce, and I come to the Redevelopment Agency meeting because I continue to be challenged with the Redevelopment Agency as it was first created by the state. Specifically, the redevelopment area at that time was the Historic West Side. Central to that plan was the employment plan policy, which called for 51% of any agency policy be people who live in that area. Now, since 1986, we've continued to stray away from the employment plan policy, which is why the agency was created in the first place. So a few years ago, there was a 51% requirement that anybody working on an RDA policy had to come from our community. Subsequently, that law was changed, so instead of a 51% goal, there became a 15% requirement.
Right.
And I maintain that we still fail to achieve that 15% requirement from people in my neighborhood being put on these jobs. So my question is, if we are not fulfilling the intent of the law, if we're not fulfilling the requirements of the redevelopment agency, why then do we continue to spend taxpayer funds for a purpose that it was not intended?
Thank you. I'm not sure whether this goes to legal or to Mr. Olivas, wherever you are, but what is the monitoring of that 15% in that requirement? Okay.
So, okay.
Oh, Mr. Arndt. Good.
Mayor Goodman, members of City Council, Bill Arntz, Director, Economic and Urban Development. I don't know if we're agendized for this, but I could certainly answer the question. We do maintain
One sec.
reports.
Let me go to legal. Can we address this as a question in public comment part, where we're not to respond, but
Yeah, Bill can answer the question. We just don't want to have a discussion amongst the council members.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. To answer the question, we do maintain a report for every expenditure that we make from the redevelopment agency. We have an employment plan that's on file to show how we're complying with both our state law as well as our policy for the redevelopment agency.
Okay. Ms. Duncan, you did hear that, yes? We're not to engage, but here's an answer and a file for
And
you.
the last report we got, we clearly see that there's a 15% on the construction, but nothing on the permanent employment. And so I agree, 15% on construction, you're doing a great job, but on permanent employment, we're failing miserably. And I don't see a plan to achieve that.
Madam Mayor?
unless somebody can show me something different.
Yep, and not to respond back to public comment, but just to comment in general, is that it's no secret that it is a huge priority of mine to get our unemployment numbers down to a reasonable, manageable, level instead of at the 15%. And now after the recession, we know that it's going to be a lot higher than it is today. And so I want to get with you, Mr. Arndt, and to discuss exactly what that employment plan is and to go through it, and we'll do a deep dive into it and see where we are, and so that we can get a baseline, and then we can move forward to how we ties that into our Ward 5 Works program in order to get people working. Because it is a high priority of mine in our office to get the people in our ward. If we're going to bring dollars into our ward, then the people in our ward need to reap the benefits of that as well with employment. And so I am in full compliance with that.
Thank you so much, Councilman.
Thank you.
And thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arndt. Thank you, Ms. Duncan. Thank you, Councilman. Okay, anyone else in public wishing to make comment here? I will close public comment, and now we will go ahead. Any other comments from council? Seeing none, I'm going to ask Mayor Pro Tem for a motion on agenda item 4.
Madam Mayor, I move to approve agenda item 4.
Thank you. There's a motion to approve agenda item 4. Please vote and please post. That motion carries unanimously. We will now move on to agenda item 5.
Madam Mayor, I move to approve agenda item 5.
Thank you. There's a motion to approve agenda item 5. Please vote. And please post. That also carries unanimously. And now on to our resolutions. This is agenda item 6. R 242020, discussion for possible action regarding a resolution establishing the Fiscal Stabilization Special Revenue Fund to stabilize operations during periods of economic downturn or for the mitigation of the effects of disasters. And was there a comment, Mr. Dorkak, on this?
No, ma'am, the next one.
Okay, so is there a motion, Mayor Pro Tem, please?
Madam Mayor, I move to approve agenda item number 6.
There's a motion on 6. Please vote and please post. Unanimously passed. And now on number 7, let me read that, and then if you'll make the comment, Mr. Dorkak. R 252020, discussion for possible action regarding a resolution establishing the Care Center Internal Service Fund to be used to account for costs associated with a centralized call center where citizens can call and receive the most current city information, respond to customer inquiries and complaints, as well as a central location to make all payments for services offered by the city, reference all wards.
Again, for open meeting law purposes, the agenda item is misworded. The resolution establishes the Customer Service and Payment Center Internal Services Fund. The resolution in the backup and everything there is correct, though.
Thank you very much. And Mayor Pro Tem.
Madam Mayor, I move to approve agenda item number 7.
Thank you very much. As amended by Attorney Dorkak.
As amended
Right.
by Attorney Dorkak, yes.
Fine. There's a motion. Please vote and please post. And that motion carries unanimously as well. Bravo. Do we do anything more except 8? Okay. This is agenda item 8, citizen participation. Public comment during this portion of the agenda must be limited to matters within the jurisdiction of the City Council and Redevelopment Agency. No subject may be acted upon by the City Council or Redevelopment Agency unless the subject is on the agenda and scheduled for action. If you wish to be heard, please come to the podium, give your name for the record. The amount of discussion, any single subject, as well as the amount of time any single speaker is allowed may be limited. Is there anyone in our e-service public comment area online? Do we have anybody? Nothing. Anyone wishing to speak under this portion of the agenda? Thank
Yes.
you.
Stephen, Captain Truth Dempsey. Glad I stuck around for this. Reminded me a lot of the virus situation. We had an expert that we paid a ton of money.
Your name again, I'm so sorry for our record.
What?
The name, your name again
Stephen.
for the record.
Captain Truth Dempsey.
2 minutes.
Sorry. It reminded me a lot about the coronavirus situation. We had an individual that we paid a ton of money through the years to be an expert, and he was about 5% right of his estimates of the deaths. He wasn't even close. If I and my girl had funded a vehicle appropriations fund and started dumping money into it, same as paying an expert, and time went by, and I said, young lady, how many vehicles do we have out there in our vehicle appropriation group that we've been paying for this guy all this money to do this for us? And she looks out and she says, well, there's your car and my car. And I look at the statistics of what we paid, and there should be 80 vehicles out there, according to the expert, but there's 2. I heard some information about property taxes and why the property taxes went up on the 1st when things were going great. And then I thought I saw the property taxes going up again next year after this year. I mean, that's a joke. I wish you the best of luck, and I know this is tough, but could you make it a little more complicated?
Thank you.
Thank you.
For coming. Anyone else wishing to make comment? Well, as a final closing, before I'm going to close public comment here, but before I adjourn, I want to thank Mr. Adams, your entire staff, Mr. Aimling, everybody that's been working so diligently through a very rough time. I think we've come a very, very long way. And as we look to Memorial Day, and the thanks to all those who sacrificed so much and totality of themselves so that we could have today. We just have to keep going forward. We have to keep doing better. And we have to be a more compassionate community and certainly world. And all I can say is it's an honor to serve here, serve a wonderful family of people that really do give themselves tirelessly and selflessly to keeping our city moving forward and doing the best we can for those we serve. It's all about each one of us first and only saying, I'm committed to this and I will help. And I am so proud of everybody that works in this city. I think the people that have been working in our medical field to take care of this virus, and for everybody that does their own piece. Everybody's a first responder. There isn't just one area. Some do it as a living every day of their lives because that's their passion. But the reality is those that we honor on Memorial Day prepared life for us today. So too do we have a responsibility to those coming after we're all gone. And we need to keep hanging together and doing it and not be self-serving in it, but really serve each other well with humility, with compassion, with understanding, and acceptance. And so I just can't tell you how wonderful it is to work in the city of Las Vegas with the team that's collected day in and day out. And to my peer council persons, to all of our staff in every department, the world needs to live like Las Vegas does. We're a unique group of people. Make mistakes, of course, but keep plowing ahead. And so particularly as the redevelopment and city budgets have been worked on tirelessly, we all sitting up here, thank you for that, and thank you for the efforts of this great staff. You're wonderful people, and you're intelligent, and you keep going forward, and that's what we have to do. So thank you, and with that, I will take this special joint City Council and Redevelopment Agency budget meeting and tell you it's all adjourned. Thank you, our clerks.